Jake Harrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he counted the money in his worn leather wallet. It had been the best cattle drive season he'd ever had. 3 months of hard work under the burning Montana sun, and now he had more cash than he'd seen in years. His calloused hands, rough from years of rope work and handling cattle, carefully folded the bills back into his wallet. The year was 1952, and Jake was 28 years old. He was known throughout the county as one of the best cowboys around. People said he could break any wild horse and could spot a sick cow from a mile away. But Jake had one big problem. He never could walk away from a challenge. His pride got him into trouble more times than he could count. That evening, Jake walked into Murphy's saloon with his head held high and his wallet heavy in his back pocket. The wooden floors creaked under his boots as he made his way to the bar. The saloon was filled with smoke from cigarettes and the smell of cheap whiskey. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air. Jake ordered a whiskey and looked around the room. In the corner sat Tommy Mitchell, the son of the richest rancher in 3 counties. Tommy was surrounded by his usual group of friends, all dressed in expensive clothes that looked like they'd never seen a day of real work. Tommy's voice carried across the room as he bragged about his upcoming engagement. "That's right, boys," Tommy said with a wide grin. "Next month I'm marrying Catherine Wells, the banker's daughter. Prettiest blonde girl you ever did see, and her daddy's got more money than sense." Jake took a long sip of his whiskey and couldn't help but shake his head. Tommy had never worked a real day in his life. Everything he had came from his father's money. Jake had grown up poor, working since he was 12 years old just to help his family put food on the table. "Must be nice," Jake called out from the bar, "having daddy's money to buy yourself a pretty wife." The saloon went quiet. Every conversation stopped and all eyes turned to look at Jake and Tommy. Tommy's face turned red with anger as he stood up from his chair. "What did you just say, cowboy?" Tommy walked closer to Jake, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden floor. Jake turned around slowly, setting his glass down on the bar. "I said it must be nice having money to buy whatever you want. Some of us have to work for what we get." Tommy laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. "You think you're better than me because you smell like cattle and sleep in the dirt? At least I can get a beautiful woman to marry me. What about you, Jake? When's the last time a decent woman even looked your way?" The other men in the saloon started to gather around, sensing a fight coming. Jake felt his face getting hot with anger. He'd been working hard his whole life, and here was this spoiled rich boy making fun of him. Any woman would be lucky to have a man who works honest for his living. Jake shot back. Unlike some people who just ride on daddy's coattails, Tommy's eyes got narrow and mean. "Is that so? Well, let me tell you something, cowboy. Women don't want a man who smells like horses and has dirt under his fingernails. They want a man who can provide for them, who can give them nice things." "You don't know the first thing about what women want," Jake said, taking a step closer to Tommy. "Oh, really?" Tommy smiled, but it was a cold smile. "I bet I could get any woman in this town to marry me before you could get one to even dance with you." Jake felt the whiskey burning in his stomach and his pride burning even hotter. "That's a load of bull, and you know it." Tommy looked around at all the men watching them. "You want to bet on it, cowboy?" Jake should have walked away. He should have finished his drink and gone home to his small cabin. But the whiskey and his wounded pride made him stupid. "What kind of bet?" Tommy's smile got wider. "Simple. We'll let fate decide. The first unmarried woman who walks through those doors has to be the woman you marry. If you can't get her to say yes, you give me every penny you made this season and leave town for good." The men around them started whispering. This wasn't just any bet, this was serious business. In their small town, a man's word was everything. If Jake agreed to this bet in front of all these witnesses, he'd have to follow through or lose everything he'd worked for. Jake looked at the saloon doors. It was almost 9 o'clock at night. What decent woman would come into a saloon at this hour? The only women who might show up would be the working girls from the other side of town, and they were all spoken for or not the marrying kind. "What's wrong, cowboy?" Tommy asked loudly. "Getting scared?" Jake felt every eye in the room on him. His pride wouldn't let him back down even though a small voice in his head was screaming at him to walk away. "You're on," Jake said, and spit in his palm before holding out his hand. Tommy spit in his own palm and they shook hands. The bet was official, witnessed by everyone in the saloon. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized what he'd just done, but it was too late to take it back now. The men in the saloon gathered around, some placing side bets on what would happen. Jake ordered another whiskey, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. He kept staring at those wooden doors, hoping against hope that they would stay closed. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Jake started to relax a little. Maybe no woman would come in at all. Maybe he could call off the bet if nothing happened by closing time. Then he heard the creak of the doors opening. Every head in the saloon turned to look. Jake's heart stopped as he saw a figure silhouetted against the dim light from the street. It was definitely a woman, and she was definitely alone. As she stepped into the light of the saloon, Jake got his first good look at her. She was beautiful, but not in the delicate way that most men in town seemed to prefer. She had long, dark hair that fell in waves down her back, and skin the color of warm honey. Her dark eyes scanned the room with intelligence and determination. She wore a simple but clean dress, and her hands looked strong, like they were used to hard work. This was Isabella Rodriguez, the blacksmith's daughter. Jake knew who she was, but they'd never really talked. She was known throughout the town as a woman who could do anything a man could do. She worked in her father's forge, spoke Spanish, English, and some French, and had turned down more marriage proposals than any other woman in the county. Isabella looked around the saloon with obvious discomfort. She clearly didn't want to be there, but she seemed to be looking for someone. "Excuse me," she said in a clear, strong voice. "I'm looking for my brother Miguel. Has anyone seen him?" The saloon stayed quiet. All the men were looking back and forth between Isabella and Jake, waiting to see what would happen next. Tommy clapped Jake on the shoulder with a big grin. "Well, Cowboy, there's your bride. Better get over there and propose." Jake felt like his legs were made of lead as he walked across the room toward Isabella. She watched him approach with curious eyes, clearly wondering why everyone was staring at her. "Miss Rodriguez," Jake said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. I need to talk to you about something." Isabella raised one eyebrow. "About my brother?" "No, ma'am, about—" Jake looked back at all the faces watching him, then back at Isabella. "About a situation I've gotten myself into." Jake took a deep breath and told Isabella everything. He explained about the bet, about how his pride had gotten the better of him, and about how the bet was legally binding with all these witnesses. He watched her face change from confusion to disbelief to anger as he talked. When he finished, Isabella stood there in silence for a long moment. Her dark eyes were flashing with fury, and Jake was sure she was going to slap him across the face and storm out of the saloon. Instead, she surprised everyone by laughing. It wasn't a happy laugh, though. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when life plays a really mean trick on them. "So let me understand this," Isabella said. "You made a stupid bet, and now you want me to marry you to save your pride and your money?" Jake felt his face burning with shame. "I know how it sounds, Miss Rodriguez. I know I have no right to ask this of you. But yes, that's exactly what I'm asking." Isabella looked around the saloon at all the men watching them. Then she looked back at Jake, studying his face carefully. "What's in it for me?" she asked. Jake blinked in surprise. He'd expected her to refuse immediately. I don't know. I hadn't thought that far ahead." Isabella nodded slowly. "Of course you hadn't. Men like you never think about what women might want or need." She was quiet for another moment, and Jake could practically see her mind working. Finally, she spoke again. "I'll consider your proposal, Mr. Harrison, but not here and not now. If you're serious about this, you'll come to my father's forge tomorrow morning. We'll discuss terms then." With that, Isabella turned and walked back toward the saloon doors. Just before she left, she turned back to face the room. "And Miguel," she called out, "if you're hiding in here somewhere, you'd better get home right now before Papa sends me back looking for you." A young man sheepishly emerged from behind a group of cowboys and hurried after his sister. Jake stood in the middle of the saloon, watching the doors swing shut behind Isabella. The other men slowly started talking again, but Jake barely heard them. His mind was spinning with what had just happened. Tommy walked over with a satisfied grin. "Well, Cowboy, looks like you might just have yourself a bride after all. That is, if she doesn't decide to skin you alive?" Jake barely slept that night. He kept tossing and turning in his small bed, thinking about what he would say to Isabella the next morning. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see her dark eyes staring at him with that mixture of anger and calculation. What kind of terms would she want to discuss? And more importantly, what if she decided to just say no and walk away? When the sun finally came up, Jake washed his face with cold water from the basin and put on his cleanest shirt. He combed his hair back and tried to make himself look as respectable as possible. His hands were shaking as he walked through town toward the Rodriguez family forge. The forge was located on the edge of town, in a large wooden building with a stone chimney that was already sending smoke into the morning air. Jake could hear the sound of metal being hammered before he even reached the door. He stood outside for a moment, gathering his courage, then knocked. "Come in," called a man's voice. Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the forge. The heat hit him immediately, even though it was still early morning. The room was filled with tools, pieces of metal, and the smell of coal and hot iron. An older man with graying hair and strong arms was working at the main forge, shaping a piece of red-hot metal with expert strikes of his hammer. This was Eduardo Rodriguez, Isabella's father. He was known throughout the county as the best blacksmith for 100 miles. People brought their horses to him from 3 towns over because he could shoe a horse better than anyone else around. "Mr. Rodriguez," Jake said, taking off his hat. "I'm Jake Harrison. I'm here to see your daughter." Eduardo looked up from his work and studied Jake with sharp eyes. "Ah, yes. The cowboy with the gambling problem. Isabella told me about your situation." Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment. "Yes, sir. I know how it must sound." Eduardo set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a leather apron. "It sounds like the actions of a foolish young man who let his pride get the better of his common sense." Before Jake could respond, Isabella's voice came from the back of the forge. "Papa, let me handle this." Isabella emerged from the shadows, and Jake was struck again by how beautiful she was. In the daylight, he could see that her dark hair had hints of red in it, and her eyes were the deepest brown he'd ever seen. She was wearing a leather apron over her dress, and her hands were dirty from working with metal. Somehow this made her even more attractive to Jake. "Mr. Harrison," Isabella said formally, "thank you for coming." "Papa, could we have some privacy?" Eduardo nodded and gathered up some tools. "I'll be working on Mrs. Chen's wagon wheel outside. Take your time." He paused at the door and looked back at Jake. "But remember, young man, this is my daughter you're talking to. Treat her with the respect she deserves." When they were alone, Isabella gestured for Jake to sit on a wooden stool near the forge. She remained standing, crossing her arms over her chest. "So," she said, "let's talk about your proposal." Jake cleared his throat. "Miss Rodriguez, I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. I was drunk and stupid, and I let Tommy Mitchell get under my skin. That much is obvious," Isabella said dryly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Jake looked down at his hands. "I was hoping you might consider marrying me. I know it's a lot to ask, and I know you don't know me very well." Isabella walked over to a table covered with metal tools and picked up a small hammer, turning it over in her hands as she thought. "Tell me about yourself, Jake Harrison," she said. "What kind of man are you?" Jake wasn't sure how to answer that question. I work hard. I've been a cowboy since I was 16. I don't drink much except for last night. I don't gamble except for last night. I go to church most Sundays when I'm not working." Isabella nodded. "What about your family?" "My parents died when I was young," Jake said quietly. "Fever took them both the same winter. I've been on my own since then, working different ranches, saving up money. Do you want children someday?" Jake felt his face getting hot again. Yes, ma'am. I think I would." Isabella set down the hammer and turned to face him fully. "Here's what I think, Mr. Harrison. You've gotten yourself into a mess because of your pride, and now you're looking for someone to get you out of it. You don't really want to marry me. You just don't want to lose your money and leave town." Jake started to protest, but Isabella held up her hand to stop him. "However," she continued, "I have my own problems. My father is sick. He tries to hide it, but I can see that he's getting weaker every month. The doctor says his heart isn't strong anymore. We need money for medicine, and we're behind on our taxes. If we can't pay what we owe, we'll lose the forge." Jake looked around the forge, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a business, it was the Rodriguez family's whole life. "So here's what I'm thinking," Isabella said. "Maybe we can help each other. But if we do this, we do it my way, with my rules." "What kind of rules?" Jake asked. Isabella began counting on her fingers. "First, this marriage would be in name only. We would live in the same house, but we would have separate bedrooms. Second, the marriage would last for exactly 1 year. After that, we get a quiet divorce and go our separate ways. Third, you would help support my family financially during that year." Jake listened carefully to each rule. They seemed reasonable considering the circumstances. Fourth, Isabella continued, you would treat me with respect at all times. I won't be your servant or your property. I'll continue working in the forge with my father. And fifth, no one in town needs to know that this is just an arrangement. As far as everyone else is concerned, we're a real married couple. Jake thought about everything Isabella had said. It wasn't what he had imagined when he thought about getting married someday, but it would solve his immediate problem, and Isabella was right, they could help each other. Those terms seem fair, Jake said. But I have one question. Why would you be willing to do this? There must be other ways to get money for your father's medicine. Isabella's expression grew sad. I've tried everything else, Mr. Harrison. I've asked for loans, but no bank will lend money to a Mexican family no matter how good our reputation is. I've tried to get more work, but there's only so much business in a town this size. And the men who have offered to help... She paused, looking uncomfortable. Let's just say their offers came with conditions I wasn't willing to accept. Jake felt a flash of anger at the thought of men trying to take advantage of Isabella's situation. I understand. And I promise you, if we do this, I'll never ask anything of you that you're not willing to give freely. Isabella studied his face for a long moment, as if she was trying to see into his soul. Finally, she nodded. All right, Mr. Harrison, I accept your proposal, but we do this properly. You'll ask my father for permission, and we'll have a real wedding in the church. I won't have people saying I married beneath myself or that we did something shameful. Jake stood up and held out his hand. It's a deal, Miss Rodriguez. Isabella shook his hand firmly. Her grip was strong from years of working in the forge. Call me Isabella. After all, we're going to be married. 3 days later, Jake stood at the altar of St. Mary's Catholic Church, wearing his best suit and trying not to sweat too much. The church was packed with people from town, all curious to see this unusual wedding. Some had come to support the Rodriguez family. Others just wanted to see what would happen. Isabella walked down the aisle in a simple white dress that had belonged to her mother. She looked beautiful, but her face was serious and determined. When she reached the altar, she looked Jake straight in the eyes, and he could see both strength and nervousness there. Father Miguel, the elderly priest who had baptized Isabella as a baby, performed the ceremony. His voice was solemn as he spoke about the sacred bond of marriage and the commitment that husband and wife make to each other. When it came time for vows, Jake and Isabella spoke the traditional words, but neither of them smiled. They both knew this wasn't a marriage born of love, but of necessity and mutual benefit. Do you, Jake, take Isabella to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do, Jake said, his voice steady. Do you, Isabella, take Jake to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? Isabella hesitated for just a moment, then spoke clearly. I do. Father Miguel blessed their union and pronounced them husband and wife. You may kiss the bride, he said. Jake leaned forward and gave Isabella the briefest, most respectful kiss possible. It was barely more than a brush of lips, but Jake felt something electric pass between them in that moment. The congregation clapped politely as the new couple walked back down the aisle together. Outside the church, people threw rice and offered congratulations, but Jake could see the puzzled looks on many faces. This hadn't been the joyful celebration that most weddings were. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the Rodriguez family home. Eduardo had insisted on providing food and music, even though money was tight. He seemed genuinely happy about the marriage, and Jake realized that Isabella hadn't told her father about their arrangement. As far as Eduardo knew, this was a real love match. The first few months of marriage were awkward and uncomfortable for both Jake and Isabella. They moved around each other like polite strangers, careful not to get too close or say too much. Jake would wake up before dawn and leave for work at the ranch, often not returning until after dark. Isabella spent her days at the forge with her father, coming home only to cook simple meals that they ate in silence. Their conversations were limited to practical matters. The roof needs fixing before the rains. Come, we're running low on coffee. Your father seemed tired today. They were like two people sharing a boarding house rather than a married couple sharing a home. Jake kept his promise about helping Isabella's family financially. Every week, He gave her money for her father's medicine and to help with the household expenses. Isabella accepted the money with quiet dignity, always saying thank you but never making Jake feel like she owed him anything beyond their agreed arrangement. The people in town watched them with curiosity. Some whispered that it was an odd marriage, that the couple never seemed particularly affectionate with each other. But others pointed out that both Jake and Isabella were serious, hard-working people, and maybe they just weren't the type to show their feelings in public. Everything began to change when winter arrived early and harsh. November brought snow and freezing temperatures that lasted for weeks. Jake had been working long days trying to move cattle to winter pastures when he caught a cold that quickly turned into something much worse. It started with a cough and a fever. Jake tried to keep working, thinking it would pass, but after 3 days he could barely get out of bed. His chest felt like it was on fire, and he couldn't stop shivering even when he was wrapped in every blanket he owned. Isabella found him collapsed on the floor of their cabin when she came home from the forge one evening. He was burning with fever and struggling to breathe. She immediately sent word to Dr. Wilson, the town's only doctor, but the roads were blocked with snow and it would be hours before he could get there. Isabella didn't wait. She moved Jake to his bed and began doing everything she could to bring down his fever. She made cold compresses for his forehead, forced him to drink water even when he was barely conscious, and sat by his bedside through the night, watching his labored breathing. Dr. Wilson finally arrived the next morning, fighting through the snowdrifts on horseback. After examining Jake, he pulled Isabella aside with a grave expression. "It's pneumonia," he said quietly. "A bad case. The next few days will tell us whether he pulls through or not. You'll need to keep him cool when the fever spikes and warm when he gets the chills. Make sure he drinks as much water as you can get into him." Isabella nodded, her face pale but determined. "What else can I do?" "Pray," Dr. Wilson said simply, "and don't leave him alone. If his breathing gets worse, send for me immediately." For the next week, Isabella barely left Jake's side. She took time off from the forge despite the fact that they needed the income. She slept in a chair next to Jake's bed, waking up every few hours to check on him and give him water or medicine. During his fevered dreams, Jake talked constantly. Isabella learned more about him in those few days than she had in all the months of their marriage. He talked about his childhood, about losing his parents, about the loneliness of working different ranches with no real home to call his own. He talked about his dreams of someday having his own land and his own cattle. But what surprised Isabella most was that he talked about her. Even in his delirium, he spoke her name with respect and kindness. He thanked her for helping his family, apologized for putting her in an impossible situation, and worried about whether she was happy. On the 4th night, Jake's fever broke. Isabella was dozing in her chair when she heard him call her name clearly for the first time in days. "Isabella?" His voice was weak but lucid. She immediately moved to his bedside. "I'm here. How do you feel?" Jake tried to sit up but was too weak. "Like I've been trampled by a whole herd of cattle." "How long have I been sick?" "Almost a week," Isabella said, helping him drink some water. "You had pneumonia. Dr. Wilson wasn't sure you were going to make it." Jake looked around the room and saw the chair pulled up next to his bed, the basin of water and cloths, the empty medicine bottles. He realized that Isabella had been taking care of him the whole time. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "You could have sent me to the doctor's office or asked someone else to help." Isabella was quiet for a moment, smoothing the blankets over him. "You're my husband," she said simply. "It was my responsibility." But Jake could see something else in her eyes. Genuine concern and relief that he was going to be okay. This wasn't just duty. Isabella had been worried about him. As Jake recovered over the next few weeks, something shifted between them. Isabella continued to bring him meals and check on him regularly, even after he was well enough to get up and move around. They began to have longer conversations, talking about books, about their childhoods, about their hopes for the future. Jake learned that Isabella had always loved to read, and that she spoke 3 languages because her mother had insisted on education for all her children. Isabella learned that Jake had taught himself to read using an old Bible and whatever newspapers he could find, and that he was much smarter than his rough appearance suggested. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Isabella asked Jake something that had been on her mind. "Why did you never marry before? I mean, before our arrangement?" You're 28 years old. Most men are settled down with families by now. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up the chimney. I guess I never found the right woman. Ranch work doesn't give you many opportunities to meet respectable ladies. And the truth is, I never thought I had much to offer a wife. No land, no house, just a cowboy's wages. Isabella nodded thoughtfully. What about you? Jake asked. You must have had plenty of men interested in courting you. Isabella smiled, but it was a sad smile. Oh, there were some. But most of them weren't interested in marrying a woman who works in a forge and has opinions about things. They wanted someone who would stay home and be quiet and grateful. That would be a waste, Jake said without thinking. Isabella looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? Jake felt his face getting warm, but he continued. I mean, you're smart and strong and capable. Any man would be lucky to have a wife who could work alongside him as an equal partner. They looked at each other across the firelight, and Isabella felt something flutter in her chest that she hadn't expected. Jake was different from the other men who had courted her. He didn't seem intimidated by her strength or intelligence. If anything, he admired those qualities. As winter continued, Jake and Isabella fell into new routines. Jake still left early for work, but now Isabella packed him lunch and they shared breakfast together. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and read or talk about their days. Isabella would tell Jake about the work she was doing in the forge, and Jake would share stories about the ranch and the other cowboys. Jake began to see Isabella in a new light. He watched her work with metal at the forge, shaping horseshoes and tools with skill and artistry. He saw how gentle she was with her aging father, helping him with the heavier work while still allowing him to maintain his dignity and independence. He noticed how she helped neighbors in need, bringing food to sick families or watching children for mothers who had to work. Isabella began to see past Jake's rough exterior to the man underneath. She saw how hard he worked, not just at his job but around their home, fixing things that needed repair and making improvements without being asked. She noticed how respectfully he treated her father, asking Eduardo's advice and listening carefully to his answers. She saw how Jake saved money carefully, not spending on himself so that he could help her family. One snowy evening in February, they were reading by the fire when Isabella looked up from her book to find Jake watching her. What is it? She asked. Jake seemed embarrassed to be caught staring. I was just thinking how nice this is. Sitting here with you, reading together. It feels peaceful. Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. It is nice, she agreed softly. They continued reading, but both of them were more aware of the other's presence than they had been before. The comfortable silence felt different now, warmer somehow. A few weeks later, Isabella was coming home from the forge when she saw Jake sitting on their front porch, playing with a small tabby kitten. Where did you find that? She asked, sitting down beside him. She was hiding under the steps, half frozen and crying for her mother. Jake explained, letting the kitten climb up his arm. I couldn't just leave her there. Isabella reached out to pet the tiny animal, and her hand brushed against Jake's. Both of them felt the spark of contact, but neither pulled away immediately. What should we name her? Isabella asked. Jake looked surprised. You want to keep her? Don't you? Jake smiled. The first real, genuine smile Isabella had seen from him since their wedding day. I'd like that very much. They named the kitten Luna because of her silver-gray markings, and she became a bridge between them. They took turns feeding her and playing with her, and she seemed to prefer sleeping curled up between them on the couch in the evenings. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and warm sunshine, and with it came a change in the air between Jake and Isabella. They had been married for 8 months now, and their relationship had grown from polite strangers to something much deeper, though neither had spoken about it directly. Jake found himself lingering at breakfast just to hear Isabella laugh at something funny Luna the kitten had done. Isabella caught herself watching out the window in the evenings, waiting for Jake to come home from work. They had developed their own little traditions. Saturday morning coffee on the front porch, evening walks through town, reading together by the fire. But underneath the growing warmth between them was an unspoken tension. Their 1-year agreement was supposed to end in just 4 months. Soon they would have to decide whether to go through with the divorce as planned, or admit that their feelings had changed. Jake was working in the yard one sunny May morning when Dr. Wilson came riding up to their cabin. his face grave with worry. "Jake," the doctor called out as he dismounted his horse. "I need you to come with me right away." "It's Eduardo." Jake's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "He collapsed at the forge this morning. Isabella sent her brother to get me, but—" Dr. Wilson shook his head. "His heart is failing, Jake. I don't think he has much time left." Jake didn't even stop to wash the dirt off his hands. He jumped on his horse and rode hard toward town, his heart pounding with fear. Not for himself, but for Isabella. She loved her father more than anything in the world. When Jake arrived at the forge, he found Isabella kneeling beside her father, who was lying on a makeshift bed they had set up in the back room. Eduardo's breathing was shallow and labored, and his skin had a grayish color that scared Jake. Isabella looked up when Jake entered, and he saw tears streaming down her face. "Papa won't wake up," she whispered. "He was working on Mrs. Johnson's gate, and then he just fell down." Jake knelt beside Isabella and put his arm around her shoulders without thinking. She leaned into him gratefully, drawing strength from his presence. "What can I do?" Jake asked Dr. Wilson. "Help me get him to my office," the doctor replied. "I have better equipment there, and he'll be more comfortable." Very carefully, Jake and Dr. Wilson carried Eduardo to the doctor's office, with Isabella walking alongside, holding her father's hand. They settled him in a bed in the back room, and Dr. Wilson did everything he could to make him comfortable. "I'm sorry, Isabella," Dr. Wilson said quietly. "His heart is just worn out. There's nothing more I can do except give him something for the pain." Isabella nodded, trying to be strong, but Jake could see her hands shaking. "How long does he have?" "Maybe a few days. Maybe a week, but you should prepare yourself." That night, Isabella refused to leave her father's side. Jake brought her food and coffee, and tried to convince her to get some rest, but she wouldn't budge from the chair next to Eduardo's bed. "I can't leave him," she said. "What if he wakes up and I'm not here? What if he needs something?" Jake understood. He would have felt the same way. So instead of trying to convince her to go home, he pulled up another chair and sat beside her. "Then I'll stay too," he said simply. Isabella looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "You don't have to do that. You need to work tomorrow." "The ranch can spare me for a few days," Jake said. "Family comes first." The word family hung in the air between them. Jake had said it without thinking, but he realized that's exactly how he felt about Eduardo and Isabella. They had become his family. For 3 days and nights, Jake and Isabella kept vigil at Eduardo's bedside. They took turns sleeping in the chairs, shared meals from the diner next door, and talked quietly about memories of Eduardo's life. Isabella told Jake stories about growing up in the forge, about how her father had taught her everything he knew about working with metal. She talked about her mother, who had died when Isabella was 15, and how Eduardo had been both father and mother to his children after that. Jake shared his own memories of Eduardo, how the older man had always been kind to him, even when Jake was just a poor cowboy who couldn't afford to pay much for horseshoeing. Eduardo had never made Jake feel ashamed of his humble background. On the third night, Eduardo finally opened his eyes. His voice was weak, but his mind was clear. "Mija," he whispered to Isabella, "my little girl." Isabella took his hand, tears flowing freely. "I'm here, Papa, I'm right here." Eduardo looked over at Jake, who was standing respectfully at the foot of the bed. "Jake, come here." Jake approached, and Eduardo reached out to take his hand as well. "I want to thank you," Eduardo said slowly, "for taking care of my daughter, for becoming the man I hoped you would be." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You don't need to thank me, sir. Isabella takes care of herself, and she's taken care of me more than I've taken care of her." Eduardo smiled weakly. "That's how I know you're the right man for her. A good husband knows when his wife is strong enough to stand on her own, but still wants to stand beside her anyway." He turned back to Isabella. "Mija, I want you to know that I've been proud of you every single day of your life. You're strong and smart and kind, just like your mother was. Don't let anyone ever make you feel like you need to be less than you are." Isabella was crying too hard to speak, so she just squeezed her father's hand. Eduardo looked back and forth between Jake and Isabella. "I can see that this marriage has become something real, something good. Don't let pride or fear keep you from admitting what your hearts already know." With those words, Eduardo closed his eyes and drifted back into sleep. He passed away peacefully just before dawn, with Isabella holding one hand and Jake holding the other. The funeral was held 3 days later. The entire town came to pay their respects to Eduardo Rodriguez, who had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him. Isabella stood at the graveside with quiet dignity, accepting condolences from friends and neighbors. Jake stood beside her, offering silent support. After the funeral, Isabella went into a deep sadness that worried Jake. She continued working at the forge, but she moved through her days like she was sleepwalking. She barely spoke, ate very little, and stared off into space for long periods. Jake tried everything he could think of to help her. He cooked her favorite meals, brought her flowers from the field behind their house, and even tried to get Luna to perform tricks to make her smile. But Isabella seemed lost in her grief. One evening, about a week after the funeral, Jake found Isabella sitting at her father's workbench in the forge, holding one of Eduardo's hammers and crying silently. "Isabella," Jake said gently, sitting down beside her. "Talk to me, please." Isabella looked at him with eyes red from crying. "I don't know how to do this without him, Jake. The forge was his whole life. These tools, this work, it's all I have left of him. But every time I try to work, I just hear his voice telling me I'm holding the hammer wrong, or that the metal isn't hot enough." Jake reached over and took the hammer from her hands, setting it carefully on the workbench. "You know what I think? I think your father would be proud of how you've kept the forge running this week. And I think he'd want you to make it your own now, not just try to copy what he did." Isabella wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't do it without him?" "Isabella Rodriguez," Jake said firmly. "You are the strongest, most capable person I know. You've been working alongside your father since you were a child. You know everything he knew, and you have your own ideas too. The forge isn't going to die with him. It's going to grow and change because of you." For the first time in weeks, Isabella really looked at Jake. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the faith he had in her abilities. "You really believe that?" "I absolutely believe that," Jake said. "And more than that, I believe in you." Something shifted in Isabella's expression. She saw not just Jake's faith in her, but the love behind it. This man who had started as a stranger forced into marriage by a foolish bet had become her greatest supporter and closest friend. "Jake," she said quietly, "when Papa was dying, he said something about our marriage becoming real. Do you think he was right?" Jake felt his heart start beating faster. This was the conversation they had both been avoiding for months. "What do you think?" Isabella looked down at her hands, then back up at Jake. "I think that somewhere along the way I stopped thinking of you as the cowboy who lost a bet. I started thinking of you as my husband. Really my husband." Jake felt like he couldn't breathe. "Isabella, I have to tell you something. I've been dreading our anniversary date in July when our agreement is supposed to end. Not because I want to get rid of you, but because I can't imagine my life without you anymore." Isabella's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. "Really?" Jake reached out and took her hands in his. "Really, I love you, Isabella. I don't know when it happened exactly, but I love everything about you. Your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, the way you laugh at Luna's antics, the way you make coffee in the morning, the way you argue with me about politics." Isabella laughed through her tears. "I love you too, Jake. I love how hard you work, how gentle you are with my father, how you fixed our roof without being asked, how you read to me in the evenings, how you stayed with me when Papa was dying." July 15th arrived with the kind of perfect summer morning that made everything seem possible. It had been exactly 1 year since Jake and Isabella's wedding, and according to their original agreement, this was the day they were supposed to sign divorce papers and go their separate ways. Instead, Jake woke up early and walked to the meadow behind their house to pick wildflowers. Isabella had mentioned once that she loved the purple lupins that grew wild there, and he wanted to surprise her with a bouquet. When he returned to the cabin, he found Isabella in the kitchen making coffee, still wearing her nightgown and robe. Her long, dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked so beautiful in the morning light that Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison," he said, presenting her with the flowers. Isabella's face lit up with delight. "They're beautiful, Jake, thank you." She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, and Jake marveled at how natural it felt now, how right it was to hold her close and start each day with her in his arms. It had been 2 months since they had admitted their love for each other, and every day had been better than the last. They had moved into the same bedroom, finally becoming husband and wife in every sense. They worked together at the forge, with Jake learning to help with the simpler tasks while Isabella handled the skilled metalwork. In the evenings, they made plans for their future together. Jake had been saving money to buy a small piece of land outside town where they could build a house and raise horses. Isabella had ideas for expanding the forge business, maybe even training other young people in the craft her father had taught her. They talked about children, about growing old together, about all the dreams they wanted to share. But today was special because it was the day they had originally planned to end their marriage. Instead, it would be the day they truly began it. After breakfast, Jake pulled out the divorce papers he had prepared months ago. Isabella watched as he fed them into the fire in their fireplace piece by piece until nothing remained but ashes. "There," Jake said, turning back to her. "Now we can never go back to being strangers." Isabella laughed. "I don't think we could do that anyway. I know too much about you now. Like how you sing off-key when you're working in the yard, and how you always put too much sugar in your coffee. And I know that you talk to Luna when you think I'm not listening, and that you cry at sad parts in books even when you've read them before," Jake replied, pulling her into his arms. They held each other quietly for a moment, both thinking about how far they had come from that night in the saloon when Jake had made his foolish bet. "Isabella," Jake said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm asking not because I have to, but because I want to." Isabella looked up at him curiously as Jake dropped to one knee right there in their living room. From his pocket, he pulled out a small wooden box. "Isabella Rodriguez Harrison," he said, "will you marry me? Really marry me this time, not because of a bet or an arrangement, but because we love each other and want to spend our lives together?" Isabella gasped as Jake opened the box to reveal a ring. It wasn't the fanciest ring in the world. Jake wasn't a rich man, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. The band was made of silver that Jake had shaped himself, learning from Isabella's father before Eduardo died. Set in the center was a small but perfect stone that caught the morning light. "Jake," Isabella whispered, "did you make this yourself?" Jake nodded, suddenly nervous. "Your father taught me how in those last weeks before he died. He helped me design it. I wanted to give you something that no one else could ever give you, something made with my own hands." Isabella held out her left hand, and Jake slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, and it felt like it belonged there. "Yes," Isabella said, her voice strong and clear. "Yes, I will marry you, Jake Harrison. Again and again, as many times as you want." Jake stood up and spun Isabella around the room, both of them laughing with pure joy. Luna meowed and ran in circles around them, apparently deciding that this was the best game ever. "So what do we do now?" Isabella asked when Jake set her down. "Now," Jake said, "we go tell the whole town that we're getting married again. And this time, we're going to have the biggest, happiest celebration this county has ever seen." The news spread through town like wildfire. At first, people were confused. Weren't Jake and Isabella already married? But when the story got out about their original arrangement and how they had fallen in love for real, the whole community was delighted. Mrs. Chen, who ran the general store, declared that it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. Father Miguel said he would be honored to perform a second ceremony. Even Dr. Wilson, who was usually a serious man, was seen smiling and telling people that he had known all along that Jake and Isabella were perfect for each other. Tommy Mitchell, the man whose original bet had started everything, came to find Jake at the ranch where he was working. "Harrison," Tommy said, looking embarrassed, "I owe you an apology. That bet I made was stupid and mean-spirited. I was jealous of you, if you want to know the truth." Jake looked at Tommy in surprise. "Jealous of me? You're the one with money and land and everything else?" Tommy shook his head. "Yeah, but you're the one with honor and integrity. And you're the one who ended up with the most amazing woman in the county. I've been thinking about that night for a year now, and I'm ashamed of myself." Jake considered this. Tommy did look genuinely sorry, and Jake had learned a lot about forgiveness from Isabella. "Well," Jake said finally, "if you hadn't made that bet, I never would have met Isabella, so maybe I should be thanking you instead." Tommy laughed. "You're a better man than I am, Harrison. I hope you and Isabella will be very happy together." The second wedding was planned for a month later, giving everyone time to prepare for what was shaping up to be the biggest celebration the town had seen in years. Isabella worked with several of the women in town to make a new wedding dress, this one even more beautiful than the first. Jake bought a new suit and spent hours practicing his vows. wanting to get every word perfect. But the most important preparation happened quietly, between Jake and Isabella themselves. They talked about everything, their hopes, their fears, their dreams for the future. They wanted to make sure that this second marriage was built on a foundation of complete honesty and understanding. "Are you sure about this?" Isabella asked one evening as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset. "Once we do this again, there's no going back. No more separate bedrooms, no more one-year agreements. Just us for the rest of our lives." Jake took her hand and squeezed it gently. "Isabella, the only thing I'm more sure of than my love for you is that the sun will rise tomorrow morning. I want to wake up next to you for the next 50 years. I want to hold your hand when we're old and gray. I want to be the father of your children and the grandfather of your grandchildren." Isabella smiled. "Just 50 years? That doesn't seem like nearly enough time." "You're right," Jake agreed. "How about forever?" Forever sounds perfect. The wedding day dawned bright and clear. This time, when Isabella walked down the aisle, her face was radiant with joy. She wore wildflowers in her hair and carried a bouquet of the purple lupins that Jake loved to pick for her. Jake stood at the altar in his new suit, grinning so widely that several people in the congregation started laughing just from watching him. When Father Miguel asked if Jake would take Isabella to be his wife, Jake's voice rang out strong and clear. "I will, with all my heart and soul." When it was Isabella's turn, she looked directly into Jake's eyes and said, "I will, for this life and whatever comes after." This time, when Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was long and passionate and full of all the love they felt for each other. The whole congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration lasted until well after midnight. There was music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. Jake and Isabella danced together for hours, talking and laughing and gazing into each other's eyes like they were the only two people in the world. As the evening was winding down, old Mrs. Patterson, who had been married to her husband for 60 years, pulled Isabella aside. "You know, dear," she said, "I've seen a lot of marriages in my time. Some are based on convenience, some on passion, some on friendship. But the best marriages, the ones that last, are based on all three. You and Jake have something special." Isabella looked across the room at her husband, who was talking with some of the other ranchers about plans to buy land together for a horse breeding operation. "How can you tell?" Isabella asked. Mrs. Patterson smiled. "Because you still look at each other like you can't quite believe your good fortune, and because you've already been through hard times together. His illness, your father's death, the difficulty of learning to live together. You've seen each other at your worst and you're still here. That's how you know it's real." Later that night, as Jake and Isabella finally made it home to their cabin, they sat together on their front porch looking up at the stars. "Do you think your father would be proud of us?" Jake asked. Isabella leaned against his shoulder. "I think he already knew this would happen. I think that's why he was so happy when I agreed to marry you the first time. He could see something that we couldn't see yet."